Shade and Karina moved through the Echo Division corridors with quiet purpose. The faint hum of activity around them, a reminder of the stakes at hand. The secure portal room lay ahead, its runic walls glowing faintly with mystical energy. Shade walked with his usual ease, his movements as silent as his name implied, while Karina's every step radiated a controlled intensity. Shade broke the silence first, his voice low and laced with dry humour. You ever notice how these missions always start with "find out what Ravina's up to" and end with chaos? Karina shot him a glance, her violet eyes gleaming. Then let's make sure we end this one differently. As they stepped into the portal room, a technician greeted them with a nod, activating the runes that began weaving a shimmering pathway into the ether. The energy pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, resonating with the magic imbued in the structure. "Coordinates locked," the technician said, stepping back. Karina adjusted the strap of her silver katana on her back, her fingers brushing the hilt. "Do we know if the portal residue will still be there?" Shade gave a slight shrug. "If Ravina wanted to cover her tracks, it'll be gone. If she's arrogant, which she often is, we'll find something." Karina frowned. "Arrogance isn't her weakness. It's calculated. She leaves just enough to lead us where she wants." "That's why we're not following blindly," Shade countered, his tone sharper now. "We're looking for cracks in her plan, not walking into her trap." Karina nodded, conceding the point. "Fair enough." The portal shimmered brighter, casting ghostly reflections on their faces. Shade stepped forward, his form seeming to merge with the swirling energy as he moved. Karina followed, the pull of the portal's magic sending a faint hum through her bones. The transition was seamless yet disorienting, and when they stepped out the other side, the stark ruins of the prison greeted them. Smoke still lingered in the air, and the faint smell of scorched earth and metal clung to the atmosphere. Sophia's team had set up a perimeter, their vehicles and equipment forming a makeshift base around the smouldering wreckage. One of the agents spotted them and approached, her stance professional but wary. "Shade, Karina, we've been expecting you." Shade tilted his head, his dark eyes assessing her. "Good. Then you know we're here to do the digging you can't." The agent's lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped aside. "We've secured the area, but it's a mess. Watch your step." As Shade and Karina moved deeper into the prison ruins, they saw the marks of Ravina's brutal efficiency. Cells lay open, their bars twisted unnaturally. Sigils and scorch marks on the walls hinted at powerful magic used to breach the facility's defenses. Karina stopped near a crumbled section of the wall, crouching to examine the ground. Her fingers brushed a faint residue, its dark shimmer catching the light. "Voidstone," she said softly. Shade crouched beside her, his gaze narrowing. She left a trail. Either she didn't care, or she wanted us to find this. Karina's eyes darkened. "It's bait. She's daring us to follow." "Maybe," Shade said, straightening. "Or it's a distraction. We need to find the portal origin point." Karina stood, her hand resting on her katana. "Let's keep moving." Near the center of the prison, they found it. The remains of the portal. A massive scorch mark marred the ground, its edges crackling faintly with residual energy. Shade knelt, his fingers tracing the remnants of the runes that had anchored the portal. "This wasn't just Ravina's work," he said, his tone thoughtful. "This has Draven's signature all over it." Karina's expression tightened. "Draven and Ravina working together, that's worse than we thought." Shade nodded, his voice grim. "And it means whatever they're planning, it's not just about the prison break. This was a show of force, a warning." Karina glanced at the horizon, her hand gripping her katana tighter. "Then we need to warn Gunnar. They're coming for more than just us." Shade straightened, his shadowy form blending into the smoke and ruins. "We'll find their next move, and we'll make them regret it." Shade and Karina approached the makeshift command post set up by Sophia's team, a cluster of vehicles and portable monitors buzzing with activity. Agents moved with precision, their expressions tense but focused. The commanding officer, a stern-looking woman with greying hair and sharp blue eyes, stood near a table covered in maps and surveillance footage. She looked up as they approached, her gaze lingering on Shade before shifting to Karina. "You're the specialists, Echo Division sent." Shade smirked faintly, his dark eyes scanning the setup. "That's one way to put it." Karina stepped forward, her tone crisp. "What's the status?" The officer, identified by the name patch on her tactical gear as Commander Hart, folded her arms. "We've secured the perimeter and swept the area for survivors. No one was left behind. The portal residue you found is the strongest lead we have, but our tech can't decode the runes. That's why you're here." Shade exchanged a glance with Karina before responding. "What about the prisoners? Any sign of where they were taken?" Hart's jaw tightened. "No, the portal's collapse left no discernible trace of its destination. Whoever set this up didn't just want to break them out. They wanted to vanish without a trail." Karina frowned, her hand brushing the hilt of her katana. "And the guards? Survivors?" Hart hesitated. "Some, but most were neutralized during the breach. The ones who lived described an army, thralls heavily armed and clearly coordinated. They said the prisoners were taken quickly, with no hesitation." Karina's eyes narrowed. "Thralls. That confirms Ravina's involvement." Shade stepped closer to the table, his voice calm but sharp. "Did any of the guards mention a mage? Someone who could have anchored the portal?" Hart nodded, her expression grim. "Yes. Descriptions match someone we've seen in previous encounters. A tall man with voidstone-enhanced abilities. He stayed near the portal while the others handled the prisoners." Karina exchanged a look with Shade, her tone grim. "That's our target." Shade scanned the maps and footage spread across the table, his sharp eyes catching subtle details. "Your cameras caught anything useful?" Hart gestured to a nearby monitor. "This is all we have. The mage neutralized most of our systems before the breach, but a few remote feeds stayed active." Karina stepped closer, watching as grainy footage played out. Thralls poured through the portal, overwhelming the guards in a matter of minutes. The mage stood at the center, his hands glowing with dark energy as he directed the operation. Ravina herself appeared briefly, her commanding presence unmistakable. "She was here," Karina muttered, her fists clenching. Shade nodded, his expression unreadable. "And she made sure we'd know it." Hart folded her arms. "What's your next move?" Karina's gaze hardened. "We find out where they're going next." Shade glanced at Hart. "We'll need access to your full report, every detail no matter how small. And keep your team on alert. If Ravina left any traces, she might send someone to clean them up." Hart hesitated but nodded. "You'll have everything we've got. But make no mistake, this isn't just about Ravina. Whatever she's planning, it's bigger than a prison break." Shade smirked faintly, his shadowy form seeming to ripple with quiet energy. "That's why we're here." As the conversation wound down, Karina turned to Shade, her voice low. "We need to get this intel back to Gunnar." Shade nodded, his tone thoughtful. "Agreed. But we also need to figure out why Ravina needed these prisoners so badly. This wasn't just about freeing her allies. This was about building something bigger." Karina's expression darkened. "And we'll stop her. Whatever it takes." Shade gave her a faint smile, his dark eyes gleaming. "That's the spirit!" As they prepared to leave, Hart handed them a tablet containing the gathered data. "Good luck. You're going to need it." Karina gave a sharp nod, her violet eyes burning with resolve. "We make our own luck." With that, they turned and headed back toward the portal, ready to bring their findings to Echo Division and prepare for the next step in the fight against Ravina. The garage door creaked open and Darren stepped inside, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The usual hum of energy and the faint clatter of tools filled the space, but something was different. Eli was there, as expected, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, intently examining the schematics spread across the workbench, was a tall elf in shimmering, intricately patterned robes. Darren leaned casually against the doorway, crossing his arms. Well, well, looks like our resident genius picked up an intern. I didn't think the council handed those out. Eli turned, already exasperated, but her lips quirked up faintly. Darren, meet Alatheris. He's here to observe and learn, courtesy of the Guardian Council. Try to be nice. Alatheris turned, his expression calm but curious. A pleasure to meet you, he said, inclining his head slightly. Your facility is unconventional but intriguing. Darren smirked, stepping closer. That's one way to put it. But I gotta ask, are you planning to do all this learning in those fancy robes? Or is that just your version of a mechanic's uniform? Alatheris blinked, glancing down at his ornate attire. These robes are enchanted for protection and durability. I see no issue with their suitability. Sure, Darren said, nodding slowly, his tone dripping with mock seriousness. But if oil stains are part of the enchantment package, I'm impressed. Tell you what, why don't I grab you a pair of coveralls? I'd hate to see you ruin all that fancy elf flair. Eli snorted. Trying and failing to suppress a grin, Alatheris, to his credit, maintained his composure. I appreciate your concern, he said evenly, but I assure you, my attire will suffice. You're cool, Darren replied, clearly enjoying himself. Just don't come crying to me when you're scrubbing grease out of those sparkly runes. Eli clapped her hands together sharply, interrupting the banter. All right, children, can we focus on the task at hand? The Wolfmobile needs an engine, and I need less talking and more doing. Darren grinned, grabbing a wrench and tossing it lightly in his hand. You heard the boss? Alatheris. Time to roll up those enchanted sleeves and get to work. Alatheris raised an eyebrow but stepped forward, his gaze shifting to the engine on the stand. Very well. Show me what needs to be done. Eli sighed, muttering under her breath as she handed Alatheris a tool. This is going to be interesting. A lesson in mechanics. Alatheris studied the engine on the stand with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. The gleaming metal components, wires, and enchanted modifications were a stark contrast to the clean elegance of elven craftsmanship. He glanced at Eli, who was already pulling up a diagram on her tablet. This, she said, pointing to a glowing part of the schematic, is the kinetic energy regulator. It's delicate, and if you mess with it too much, we'll be looking at a small explosion. So be careful. Alatheris nodded solemnly, picking up a wrench and approaching the engine with an air of determination. Darren watched from the sidelines, leaning casually against the workbench with a smirk on his face. Careful there, Sparkles, Darren said, folding his arms. Engines bite back if you don't sweet-talk them first. Alatheris gave him a flat look but didn't respond, focusing instead on tightening a bolt that looked loose. The wrench slipped, sending his hand into the edge of the frame with a loud clang. Ah! Alatheris straightened, shaking his hand and glaring at the offending metal as though it had personally insulted him. Darren's laughter echoed through the workshop. Welcome to the world of mechanics, Your Highness. First rule of the garage, the engine always wins. Eli sighed, handing Alatheris a pair of gloves. Here, might help. And next time, try not to force it. You finesse the bolt into place, not battle it into submission. Alatheris accepted the gloves with a muttered thanks, slipping them on and returning to his task. His movements were more careful this time, though the unfamiliarity of the work was evident in his stiff posture. All right, next step, Eli said, pointing to another part of the engine. We need to attach the auxiliary power core. It's enchanted to boost energy flow, but it's heavy and finicky. Darren, grab that end. Alatheris, you're on stabilization. Darren straightened and moved to lift the core, grunting slightly as he shifted it into place. You weren't kidding about heavy, he muttered, adjusting his grip. Hey, Alatheris, mind giving me a hand here instead of staring at it like it's going to assemble itself? Alatheris quickly stepped in, holding the core steady as Eli guided them through the installation. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his immaculate robes had a streak of grease on the sleeve. "You're doing fine," Eli said, her tone surprisingly encouraging. "Just hold it steady while I secure the clamps." Darren glanced at Alatheris, his smirk returning. "Not bad for a first-timer, though I'd say you're about 3 grease stains away from looking like a real mechanic." Alatheris ignored him, focusing intently on the task. With Eli's guidance, the core clicked into place, its enchanted runes glowing faintly as it powered up. "There," Eli said, stepping back and wiping her hands on her apron. "Not perfect, but good enough for now. We're making progress." Alatheris straightened, brushing at his robes with an air of dignity despite the smudges of grime. "This mechanical work is more challenging than I anticipated, but I see its value." "Welcome to the club," Darren said, clapping Alatheris on the shoulder. "You survive a few more busted knuckles and oil baths, and you might even start liking it." Eli rolled her eyes, but a small smile played at her lips. "All right, let's get this thing finished before Gunnar comes back and starts asking why it's still in pieces." With the auxiliary power core installed, the Wolfmobile was starting to look less like a project and more like a functioning vehicle. Eli wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced at the engine stand, where the rest of the components waited. "All right," she said, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Let's get this engine mounted. Darren, you're on lifting duty. Alatheris, grab the stabilizer brackets and be ready to secure them once it's in place." "Lifting duty, huh?" Darren said with a grin, flexing his arms theatrically. "You just want an excuse to admire the guns." Eli shot him a flat look. "You've got 2 jobs. Don't drop it, and don't break anything." Darren smirked but stepped up to the hoist, attaching the chains to the engine. With a steady pull on the lever, the heavy block began to rise, its polished metal gleaming under the garage lights. Alatheris moved quickly to position the brackets, his movements more confident after the earlier trial and error. "Hold it steady!" Eli called out, her eyes darting between the engine and the frame of the Wolfmobile. "If it shifts even a little, we're going to have alignment issues." "Relax, Keebler," Darren said, his voice strained as he carefully maneuvered the engine into place. "I've got this." Alatheris stepped forward, securing the first bracket with a firm twist of the wrench. His earlier inexperience was giving way to a steady rhythm, and Eli gave a nod of approval. "Good. Now, the second one." As Alatheris worked on the second bracket, the engine settled into its mounts with a satisfying clunk. Eli quickly moved in, tightening bolts and adjusting connections while Darren held the hoist steady. "Almost there," Eli said, her tone focused. "Darren, lower it a bit so I can connect the fuel lines." The engine dropped a fraction, and Eli's hands moved deftly, attaching lines and securing clamps. Alatheris handed her tools as needed, his keen eyes tracking her movements with growing understanding. Finally, Eli stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Okay, that's it. Everything's in place. Now let's see if this thing actually works." Darren grinned, rubbing his hands together. "Moment of truth, huh? Should we say a prayer, or does the elf here have a magic chant for good luck?" Alatheris arched an eyebrow. "I believe competence is the best assurance of success." "All right, philosopher," Darren quipped. "Let's fire this baby up." Eli slid into the driver's seat, flipping switches and pressing buttons with practiced ease. The Wolfmobile's dashboard lit up, runes glowing faintly alongside the digital displays. She pressed the ignition and for a moment there was silence. Then, with a deep rumble, the engine roared to life. The entire vehicle vibrated as the enchanted core synced with the mechanical components, its power radiating through the frame. "Yes!" Eli exclaimed, her usual composure slipping for a moment as she grinned. "It's alive!" Darren let out a low whistle, patting the side of the Wolfmobile. "Keebler, you've outdone yourself. This thing purrs like a kitten. A really angry, magical kitten." Alatheris stepped back, crossing his arms as he observed the humming vehicle. Impressive. Your methods may be unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. Eli slid out of the driver's seat, her grin fading slightly as she eyed the vehicle critically. It's not perfect, but it's ready. And just in time, too. Gunner's going to want this operational ASAP. Darren clapped his hands together. All right, team. Engines in. Wolfmobiles ready to roll. And nobody lost any fingers. I call that a win. Eli shook her head, but the faint smile on her face betrayed her amusement. Let's just hope it holds up in the field. The sterile hum of the medical bay greeted Gunner as he pushed through the heavy double doors, his boots echoing softly against the pristine tile floor. The room was bathed in a soft, diffused light, the glow of magical runes interspersed with advanced medical equipment. At the far end, Caleb lay in a recovery bed, his pallor improving, though his movements were still slow and deliberate. Seated near him were Rose, Argos, and Evelyn, the latter perched on the edge of her chair, a journal balanced on her lap. Her colour had returned, and she seemed fully recovered, though the worry etched on her face suggested her focus remained on Caleb. Argos sat with her arms crossed, the gem pulsing faintly under her touch, while Rose leaned casually against the wall, her usual smirk absent, replaced by a quiet intensity. Jewel stood by Caleb's bed, her hands glowing faintly as she performed a final scan with her enchanted medical wand. She looked up as Gunner approached, her sharp eyes softening at his presence. He's stable, Jewel said before Gunner could ask. The dark magic from the blade is dissipating, and his natural resilience is helping him heal faster than I anticipated. But he's not out of the woods yet. He'll need rest and time. Caleb stirred at the sound of her voice, his dark eyes fluttering open. He managed a faint smirk despite the exhaustion weighing him down. I'm tougher than I look, Doc. Jewel rolled her eyes but smiled. You're lucky, is what you are. That blade could have done much worse. Gunner stepped closer, his imposing presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. His gaze swept over Caleb, then the others, his expression unreadable but tinged with a faint relief. Glad to see you're still with us, Gunner said, his gruff voice carrying a weight of sincerity. Wouldn't miss it, Caleb replied, his smirk widening briefly before his eyes flicked to Argos. Though I might owe Argos here for the save, I thought I was done for. Argos shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. You'd have done the same, she muttered, her tone unusually subdued. Evelyn reached over and placed a hand on Argos's arm, her expression warm. And we're all grateful you did. But you shouldn't downplay what you've done, Argos. That gem isn't just a tool. It chose you for a reason. Rose snorted softly, crossing her arms as she glanced between them. Touching as this is, let's not forget who dragged both of your asses out of the fire back there. Caleb chuckled weakly, wincing slightly at the motion. We owe you too, Rose. You were something else out there. Rose shrugged, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. It's what I do. Besides, I wasn't about to let Draven's lackeys get away with it. Gunner nodded, his gaze settling on Rose. You did good out there. All of you did. But we can't afford to let our guard down. Draven's not going to stop, and neither is Ravina. The room fell into a contemplative silence, the weight of Gunner's words settling over them. Jewel cleared her throat, stepping back from Caleb's bedside. For now, let's focus on recovery. Caleb needs rest, and the rest of you could use it too. Evelyn stood, stretching slightly as she closed her journal. I'll keep watch. I'm not tired. Jewel gave her a pointed look. You just recovered yourself. Take shifts if you need to, but no one's burning out on my watch. Gunner crossed his arms, his piercing blue eyes sweeping over the team. You heard her. Get some rest. We've got a long road ahead. As the others murmured their agreements, Gunner lingered by Caleb's bed for a moment longer. The younger man's smirk had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. We'll get through this, Gunnar said quietly, his voice steady. You've got a good team around you. Caleb nodded, his voice soft but firm. I know.
All right, you've made it this far. That means either you like what you're seeing, or you're lost. Either way, no harm in sticking around, right? Go on, hit that subscribe button, join the team, and while you're at it, hit like, because, let's be honest, you're already invested. And the bell? That's for you if you don't want to miss any of the action. You wouldn't want me to come find you. See you soon, and remember, once you're in, you're family.